Prologue. Deathknight. Circa 7 years, 2 months, until projected exodus date. Circa 5 years, 1 month, 32 days, 28 hours, since the destruction of Irmunthal.
To find a way off their dying world before time ran out, the leaders of the 6 remaining factions of the Aframani Union had gathered in secret to discuss allegiances and solutions. That meeting was not going well. The very idea of the meeting itself provided cause for tension, but that had only grown since the faction leaders and their respective aides had arrived. Everyone had removed their masks as well. That didn't bother Estingai, but she knew it made Svemaku and the other Samyadi a bit more on edge. The gesture was one of vulnerability and trust, reserved for family and loved ones. This was not a family. Estingai, at least, could blame most of her own nerves on the meeting's location. A cave far beneath the ground, connected to the surface only by kilometers of dark, twisting tunnels and lava tubes. Estingai hated caves. The meeting chamber contained no furnishings, no hooks from which to hang lanterns, and no refreshments. Just the round metal table with foldable legs they brought with them. The commanders and their aides, each standing a step or two behind their respective faction leader, stood around it at the center of the room. They all wore clean and well-maintained clothing, if a bit worn, but Narvik's coat was the closest thing any of them had to a uniform. The armor and weapons they carried made them look even more haphazard. Most were family heirlooms or had been scavenged or looted off the bodies of the Amaya soldiers they'd killed. Estingai and her husband Svemaku wore ensembles composed of all 3. Estingai almost barked a bitter laugh as she realized that the one thing unifying all of them was their lack of any uniform or visual unity. That and our desperation.
We can't spare any more personnel to send to Darkside, Tepio,
Narvik, head of the Iron Peak faction, said. He rubbed his forehead between his antlers, squeezing his golden eyes shut for a moment before continuing. His broad shoulders looked bowed as he did so.
With the Amaya sending people there now and working on those railways of theirs, there's just too much risk. He's right, Kogan said.
The Stormswind commander often made Estingai think of a younger, angrier version of Narvik. Both men were solid, though even discounting his antlers, Kogan stood half a hand taller, with wider shoulders and a thicker chest. Kogan continued, deep voice echoing.
Raids on the supplies the Amaya trains to and from those locations, however.
We're not here to talk about lightless raids, Estingai grumbled, half to herself, half to her husband, who stood beside her. Estingai blinked when she realized Kogan had stopped talking and looked up to find all 6 commanders, including Raima, the head of Estingai's own faction, Frozen Phantom, staring at her. She resisted the urge to bite her lip under those gazes. This wasn't the first time she'd spoken her thoughts louder than she'd meant to.
Rein in your fireborn, Raima,
Kogan said, firm tone augmented by his deep voice and the stone walls of their chosen chamber. Estingai shut her mouth, but did not drop her eyes. She even met Kogan's dark gaze.
Estingai,
Raima warned. Estingai shifted her gaze to the wall behind the Stormswind commander. If the soft glow of aurora light from everyone's gem crests and the aurora lanterns had been brighter, Estingai would have been able to see her reflection in it. Instead, the obsidian walls were black mirrors, turning the shimmering lights into suggestions of specters waiting just out of sight. Estingai clenched her fists. I hate caves and tunnels and lightless underground chambers deep beneath the earth. Something brushed against her gauntleted hand, and Estingai glanced to her right to catch a faint grin from Sfemaku. Estingai barely hid her smile. They wouldn't hold hands during a meeting like this, but if they stood close enough to one another that their hands touched, so be it. What are they even doing here, Raima? Tapio grumbled, gesturing toward Estingai and her husband. I thought this meeting was leadership and only a single aid to reduce the risk of word getting out like it did last time. The leader of the Icevane faction was a solid man with a slight paunch and just enough fat under his narrow chin to give him a round, ruddy face. Estingai wondered, not for the first time, how Tapio had claimed leadership of his faction. Most of her friends that served under the man were hardy, hard-working people, while Tapio seemed the type who would just delegate any task given to him he didn't enjoy or believe would benefit him. Vila, commander of Last Shadow and the only faction leader that had worn full, if mismatched, armor, snorted. Why do you think, Tapio? Vila's voice dripped with contempt as she continued. The Knights Reborn, Matsanga, Aitiperit, Koyatere, Sulahep, they're all gone. Estingai and Sfemaku are the only knights we have left, the last of that legacy. They are the only ones left who give us anything near the edge they gave us against the Amaya. Our people, all our people. See them as heroes. They deserve to be here. Tapio's jaw bunched. He looked about to say something.
I also have good ideas now and then, Sfemaku said before the Icevane leader got the chance. And Estingai's pretty good in a fight.
Tapio and Kogan glared at Sfemaku, as did the aides both had brought along. He just grinned at them. He did that a lot. That dimpled grin and those golden eyes of his had gotten him out of just as much trouble as they'd got him into. It got him me. After getting him in trouble with her first, of course. She nearly killed him. Estingai had always considered Sfemaku too handsome for his own good, even when he wasn't grinning. It had grown worse when he'd started growing facial hair, a neat beard that gave his angular jaw a silver trim. He kept his large, fan-like antlers in a good condition, and his skin was just the right shade of light blue that it never seemed to tint the 12 colors of the glowing gem crest atop his brow. At the moment, his face bore the dark tint of his black nodes. As an Iceborn, that pair of biogems allowed him to conceal any use of auroromancy by those at the table, should an Amaya piercer pass above looking for signs of them. Estingai kept the black nodes of her own gem crest bright as well. Her Fireborn gem crest allowed her to sense nearby auroromancy, as a piercer or seeker would, though her armored jacket concealed their light. Thank you, Sfemaku, Raima said, tone neutral as she gave both him and Estingai pointed looks before turning back to the other commanders. I brought them along, Tapio, because if the Amaya does somehow find out about this meeting and send Lightforged to deal with us, Estingai and Sfemaku are the only people we have that have proven they can take on multiple Lightforged each and come out alive. Estingai grimaced. They'd done that a few times together, but Estingai hoped she never had to face one of those horrible creatures again.
If we can get back to the purpose of this meeting, Narvik said, which, as Estingai pointed out, is not to discuss raids, but combining our resources to find a way off this dying world before it's too late. Milora, do your people have any leads?
Milora, leader of Nightstone, looked around the table. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, then sighed. I have, unfortunately, decided to put a stop to our efforts to find some way to preserve Ephraimani with geauroral technology. Even if we could find the correct techniques to hold the world locked between Mirskane and the sun, or find enough biogems and spirits to create the amount of geaurorals necessary to do so, we believe we would need to build structures in orbit for them to be of any use. The resources spent testing are too... Tepio sniffed, cutting the woman off. We should put those geaurorals to work increasing the output of Icevane's lowlight farms and gardens. Bonde's death gave us the perfect cover to lie low and make Atonga think they've broken us. They eliminated the driving force behind the extremist elements, and as long as Vila and her people can keep themselves under control, Atonga will forget we exist. We can wait them out and reclaim Ephraimani once they've left. Vila stiffened, glaring at Tepio, her voice as cold as Darkside's wastes. Unfortunately, the rest of us don't have the luxury of an alternate reality, Icevane. She spat the last word. Tepio just shook his head, then looked around at all of them with an insufferable, patronizing grin. Estingai's jaw bunched. You all seriously believe that Imaya propaganda? The leather of Estingai's gauntlets creaked as she clenched her fists. It's just a tool they use to scare people into their ranks and turn them against us, Tapio continued. Now they keep it up just to... Estingai slammed her hands down on the table, cutting off the Icevane commander. Propaganda? She grated. Are you really that stupid? The Oru are gone. I haven't seen a single spirit in over a cycle. Not to mark the passing of the hours, not to signal the auroras or holidays, not to dance with the flames of our fires. Darkside is now near uninhabitable without heating technology and regular supply shipments, even for former natives. The Amaya has lost farmland outside of Mitafamonga. Do you really think the Amaya has somehow managed all of that as mere propaganda? You, Estingai. Rima did not shout, yet her voice had the effect of a cracked whip. Estingai snapped her mouth shut, but did not break eye contact with the Icevane commander. As she took her hands off the table, she felt the heat of the metal through her leather gloves. Estingai kept herself from showing her chagrin as she dimmed the pair of violet biogems on the gem crest at her collarbone. She hadn't brightened them much. Otherwise, she might have turned the table to slag or sent a wave of violet flames across it. While Estingai spoke out of turn, her words ring true, Commander Tepio, Rima said, looking around the table. Even if the end of the world was merely Amaya propaganda, the Amaya's efforts in building their massive city of Mitafamonga and their methods of fleeing to the stars have stripped Ephraimani of much of its resources. Even if we did not have patrols to keep us underground and in the shadows, what hunting and foraging parties we send out bring back less and less every time. And nearly half of our people cannot walk in the sun without needing to cover their bodies and faces. If you cannot agree that the world is, in fact, ending, or at least agree to work with us, knowing that we all hold that as paramount threat, you might as well leave now and see how well your lowlight farms serve Icevane once Ephraimani loses its stability and starts hurtling into the sun. Tepio snorted, folding his arms. You won't last long enough to escape Ephraimani without the food Icevane's lowlight farms produce. Estingai's jaw bunched as the cavern's stuffy air grew thick with tension. She primed her gray notes and violet notes, ready to act at the first sign of violence. Svemaku barked a laugh. Estingai jumped, as did a few of the commanders. Then looked at her husband, eyes wide. What in darkness? As Estingai studied Svemaku, however, she caught a glint of something familiar in his eyes. She relaxed, if only a little. Something funny, Svemaku? Raima asked. Of course, he said, shooting her a wide grin before he looked to Tepio. I'm sorry that I'm the only one here that appreciates your humor, Commander Icevane. My humor? Svemaku nodded. That bit about the end of the world being nothing more than a Maya propaganda and threatening to deny us access to the food Icevane farms produce. That was a joke, wasn't it? Svemaku paused just long enough for Tepio to open his mouth, then continued before the man could speak. It must have been a joke, he said, a bit of the mirth leaving his voice. If it wasn't, that would mean that the friends I have among your people don't realize they're being led by someone who would see them dead through willful ignorance. Surely it was a joke. Otherwise, it would mean you believe that all our people who died in our efforts to steal a Maya spacecraft died for nothing. I'm sure you didn't mean to imply that. Or that you would withhold valuable supplies from your brothers and sisters in arms just because you refuse to accept the reality around you. Surely, Commander, you did not mean that. Svemaku's voice had lost all warmth or humor, his tone dark as the cavern walls surrounding them. He pinned Tepia with an icy gaze as utter silence filled the cavern. Estingai suppressed a shiver at the silence and a smile at her husband. All the commanders and aides around the table, save for Raima and Vila, gaped or gazed wide-eyed at Svemaku. Estingai's husband was not a violent man. He was, however, a man with little patience for those who would put their own interests above those of the many. People like that brought out a darkness in him that most rarely witnessed. Everyone in this room had a darkness in them. Constant war, upheaval, and the end of the world would do that to a person. Svemaku, however, kept his own darkness from influencing what he let people see of himself. Estingai had feared that would change when the God King had killed his parents cycles ago. Yet it had not. Neither had any of the tragedy he'd experienced since. Somehow, he smiled. Estingai swore that his grins and laughter were all that kept her doing the same. Svemaku's mother had given birth to him, but his parents had chosen to take Estingai in when she'd had no one else. And now they're gone too. Svemaku, his brother Karuxi, and their adopted sister, Uchantu, were all she had left. Estingai's chest grew tight, even as Tepio cleared his throat, breaking the silence, then laughed, returning her thoughts to the matter at hand. Ha! You're right, of course. Iceborn Svemaku, the Icevane commander said, forcing a grin. You're the only one here with a sense of humor, it seems. He looked around the table before continuing. Can't a man joke about the end of the world? My thoughts exactly, Svemaku said, grinning once more. Hopefully, now we can get down to some more productive discussion, Tepio said, clearing his throat again. Icevane's low-light farms and manpower are at your disposal. I can send some of my farmers and horticulturists with seeds and saplings to your bases to find where different plants will grow best. I'm certain you all have a lot of underutilized space. Especially you, Vila, with those enormous caverns you store your stolen ships in.
That is very generous of you, Tepio,
Narvik said.
And a good start to formalizing and strengthening our alliance. Unfortunately, regardless of the amount of underutilized space we have, not all our bases have enough water, or at least not enough easily accessible sources of water, to sustain more gardens than we already have.
My engineers could help with that, Vila suggested. There's not much rock copper left on this continent, but my people have found quite a bit of leftover tools and finery from the abandoned Atonga ruins and historical sites to use for piping. We've even found some piping systems we've been able to just transplant to our own base. It's harder than field irrigation, but we've made it work. Smiling, Estingai nudged Sfamaku, glancing over at him. You're incredible, she mouthed. I love you, he mouthed back. The simple words she'd heard so many times before still sent an amazing warmth through Estingai after all this time. Merely touching his gauntleted hand with her own didn't seem enough anymore. That's not what we're here for. There would be plenty of time for the two of them to spend alone when they returned to Wolf Den. The corner of Sfamaku's mouth twitched in a grin, as though he knew what she was thinking. He usually did.
Milora, Kogan said. I don't believe you'd finished telling us about your research.
The woman smiled, then frowned. We should be able to spare some Geororos to help the rest of you if needed. As I said, we've deemed preserving Efrumani no longer viable with our resources. With the Imaya leaving, I suppose we never should have considered it in the first place. Though they had been looking to the stars even before... She paused, biting her lip and glancing around the table for a moment before continuing. Before Imuntal's destruction. The room's mood dampened at that. Everyone had known Efrumani's two Aethal, the world trees, were important. Just not how important. Not until one was gone. No one had ever imagined that day would come. The trees had resisted the few attempts to harvest their leaves and wood, such that most had believed only a god could destroy them. None of them had imagined that one of them would do just that. Thinking of that event hurt all of them, in part because most had worshipped Queshrima in one way or another. What hurt more was that no one knew why the goddess had destroyed the Aethal. Some, like Milora, refused to even speak of or acknowledge Queshrima's role in the Aethal's destruction and the world's subsequent decline, if they could help it.
And your other research, Commander Milora?
Sfamaku asked, voice warm.
Concerning escaping Efrumani through a means other than the stars.
Milora gave him a thankful smile. We've been able to confirm that the Oru do, or did, exist in another plane of existence most of the time, only passing through to our own when they decided to appear. That, combined with certain legends of the god's origins, leads me to believe it is possible for mortals to cross over to such a plane of existence, this realm of the spirits. Whether we will find a home there or find a way through there to a new home, however, remains to be discovered. We should only need a small percentage of our geororos to conduct those tests, however, so the rest are at your disposal. We should use our combined resources to hurt the Amaya, Vila said. We can launch an attack on a position far from our bases, something that will make them calm that area for a time while we regroup for another strike. Maybe the railways, something that will make them pull back into their city for a time and let us be. Rima sighed, shaking her head. We all share your motivations, Vila. But we need to keep the Amaya active along those railways. Even with piping for our water sources and Icevane's farms, we need the supplies they carry. Your engineers and Nightzone's scientists are resourceful, but we have no foundries or factories capable of producing cleaning supplies, medicines, modern weapons, or any of the other supplies and amenities the Amaya keep stocked at their own bases. Disrupting those supply lines will hurt us as much as it hurts the Amaya. Then we will strike somewhere else, Last Shadow's commander insisted. We need to make them bleed after what they did to Bonde and the others, even if he had grown too extreme in his methods. No, Vila, Rima said. We need to focus on survival, not vengeance, if we're to have any chance at hope. She paused, looking around the table. I actually believe Tepio and Kogan had the right idea, somewhat, at least. We need to lie low and make the Amaya forget about us, using the spies Kogan and I managed to place inside Mirtavamwanga to feed us information for quiet, targeted raids that have as little impact as possible on the Amaya, with the greatest reward for us. Ideally, we would make them less intense each time, so the Amaya think we are losing manpower or support. And how do we get off the planet after that? Narvik asked. Finding some way onto Mirskane Station is our best chance, and it will be difficult enough to get all of our people to the station, even if we find a way there. Not with the tech and ships we have now. Estingai's jaw tightened. It wasn't good enough. She wanted more than anything to escape this world. To fly through the stars, free to look for a new home. Yet, doing so at the cost of leaving others behind to die with Efrumani would drain all sweetness from such a victory. A glance at Sfamaku told her he felt the same way. His mouth was a thin line, eyes down and narrowed. We could steal more of their vehicles, Milor suggested. If we got our hands on some of their troop transports, my scientists and Vila's engineers should be able to use parts and technology from the vehicles we've stolen to make something that can get us out of the atmosphere and to Mirskane Station. Stealing some of those new handheld railguns would help also. There's a reason the Amaya carefully monitored and controlled the use of firearms throughout history. It's not big enough. Estingai and everyone else looked to Sfamaku. Estingai's husband still wore a contemplative expression. Would you mind elaborating on that, Iceborn? Narvik asked. Sfamaku nodded. A troop transport isn't big enough. Getting only some of us off Efrumani is not an option. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each commander with a hard expression on his handsome features. If we move forward with the end goal of only getting a handful of people off Efrumani, that means we will have to choose who survives and who lives, which could break every single one of our factions, much less any unity between us we've worked for. It also makes us no better than the Amaya. Worse, actually, since they're leaving us behind because they see us as monsters. If we surrendered to them, they'd likely kill us or imprison us in one of those lightless facilities. But they wouldn't leave us behind. I expect you have a solution in mind, Sfamaku, Rima asked. I do.
First, we are no longer 6 factions of a resistance. We can no longer think of ourselves that way if we are truly united, which is the only way this will work. We shouldn't use our separate names any longer. No more Ice Vein or Frozen Phantom or Last Shadow, save maybe to refer to the different primary bases.
Then what do we call ourselves? Melora asked.
The Remnant,
Svemaku said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment before he continued.
We are all that remains of those who fight the Amaya. Queshrima may have doomed Efrumani, but the Amaya began conquering it and stripping it of its resources and beauty long before then, in the name of fighting their supposed enemy. I can agree to that,
Kogan said after a moment of silence.
I assume you think it would be best to redistribute our people through the various bases?
Svemaku nodded.
Some won't like moving, but it won't be any worse than any upheaval we've already experienced.
And once we do that? Vila asked. Estingai narrowed her eyes at the hint of skepticism in the woman's tone.
Then we get the Amaya to attack us with one of their capital ships.
All eyes around the table grew wide. Estingai had to resist shaking her head. Svemaku always had incredible ideas. They just didn't always come out of his mouth the right way. She nudged him harder than she had before, causing him to blink.
Right,
he said, a grin sliding onto his face.
While I agree we should eventually try to lie low and make the Amaya forget about us, we first need to give them a reason to send one of their capital ships out of Miatafamwanga. Whether it's dealing with us or some other reason our spies can feed to the Amaya's high command.
And then what? Vila asked. We steal it?
Svemaku shook his head, grin growing wider. We blow it out of the sky.
That caused even more confusion than his first statement. Estingai was almost certain he'd done that on purpose. I believe what my husband means, Estingai said, is that if we try to steal one of the Amaya's larger ships, they will know that we have it, and that will motivate them to reclaim it. If we instead destroy it, though ideally without too much damage, they will believe we did so for supplies and weapons rather than for the craft itself, and might believe salvaging the wreckage not worth the effort.
Exactly,
Svemaku said, grinning around the table.
And this way we wouldn't need to commandeer the Amaya's space station. Was that not clear?
This time, Estingai sighed. Vila, do you have any caverns large enough to rebuild a capital ship? Last Shadow's commander thought for a moment, then shook her head. We have one that might work, Tepio said. We've used it as a gathering area, a hospital, and as some extra farming space, since it has no connections to the outside. Tepio looked around the table. If we could have some shapers to widen it and make it accessible to the outside, it might work. With some Giororo reinforcements from Nightstone, of course. Once we open it up enough to fit a cruiser in, however, we won't be able to hide it in that cavern again. What if critical components are damaged when we take it out? Melora said. We won't be able to replicate reactors or power cells of that size, and those on the ships we've stolen won't be powerful enough to fuel the ship. Our spies can help with that, Raima said. It will be dangerous, but if we need to replace any parts we can't fabricate ourselves... Estingai blinked, stiffening as she tuned out Raima. For a moment, she thought she'd sensed... Estingai rolled her shoulders, then moved her head from side to side to cover a glance around the room as she brightened her black notes. Nothing. She couldn't sense Svemaku, but she should have felt anything coming from outside the immediate area of his shroud. Still nothing. That could mean she'd been mistaken. Or it could mean whoever she'd sensed had dimmed their biogems and was still there, invisible to Estingai's senses. She flared her black nodes in a burst of power. She held it only for a few seconds, but that should have allowed her senses to reach out even farther, possibly all the way to the surface or down one of the long tunnels. Again, nothing. Estingai bit her lip, considering brightening her opal nodes to allow her to flare her black nodes in one massive burst. Something only full Aurora-born like she and Sfamaku could do, as opal nodes were essentially useless on their own. She decided against it, instead brightening her clear nodes to enhance her other senses. She blinked as all her sensory input increased 12-fold and took a moment to adjust.
If we wait until just before a supply shipment goes out to one of their darkside bases, or their people at the end of the railway and create a roadblock,
Sfamaku was saying. His voice sounded as though he was speaking directly into her ear.
Something that they can't easily clear away in a day or two, we could have our spies encourage the decision to send out supplies on one of their older capital ships with a minimal crew.
Estingai tuned out the conversation again, focusing on other sounds. There weren't many, save for the occasional shifting, creaking, and clinking of fabric and armor. The Stark chamber's cool temperature and dim lighting made it easier for her to adjust. Her vision sharpened, gaining more contrast, and she became more aware of the slight chill against her face and the sensation and weight of her clothing and armor against her skin. Her mouth was dry and tasted like the dried meat ration she'd eaten before the meeting. She tuned out the slight body odor from those around her, including herself, and the spike of arousal that always came with brightening one's clear nodes. Closing her eyes would have allowed Estingai the greatest focus on the sounds around her, but she didn't want to look uninterested or alarm anyone without cause. Even if I did sense someone, these tunnels twist and turn and intersect for kilometers, and Sfamaku's shroud will keep us concealed. The soft clink of an armored footstep near the back of the room made Estingai tense. The lights went out. Estingai whirled around, priming all 12 pairs of biogems and donning her mask, more of a helmet really, styled after the visage of an ice hawk, almost without realizing she'd done so, seeing only by her enhanced senses in the dim light of the other's gem crusts reflected off the glassy walls. Despite her Samyati blue skin, she didn't possess the golden eyes and natural night vision like Sfamaku and the others with stronger Samyati blood. What she saw turned her veins to ice. A tall, imposing figure, outlined by points of aurora light shining in all 12 colors, approached from the darkness with a steady, purposeful stride. It wore armor of polished iron that Estingai knew all too well, the metal reflecting the light of the infused biogems set into it. Estingai's hands flexed toward the weapons at her waist, but she drew neither. Swords did little good against the Lightforged. She didn't have enough rounds with her to shoot the creature until it could no longer heal itself, and the railgun strapped to her back would take too long to charge for close-range use. Even then, the rapport of either firearm would deafen everyone in the chamber, enhanced hearing or not. Estingai could create her own weapons, anyways. Better ones. The rasp of Titan steel and readying of firearms behind Estingai told her that the others had drawn their weapons. They didn't have any better options. She and Sfamaku were the only two here with red notes. Something seemed off about the Lightforged armor as it approached in silence. Like all Lightforged Estingai had encountered, It wore a full helmet with a detailed faceplate, this one stylized after a light-side dracon, concealing its own face as it mocked the Samyati tradition. Tall, wicked antlers sprouted from its forehead, the helm crafted to accommodate them, as was Sphamaku's. Its armor glittered with infused biogems it could draw power from if needed, and the plates were iron. The metal had no effect on the Lightforged itself, yet it burned anyone else, Natari or Samyati, who touched it. That was all standard, yet this Lightforged seemed more impressive than those Estingai had fought before. Is it more ornate? Did the Amaya send an officer after us? As far as she knew, Lightforged only had one commander among them. No. Estingai froze, coming to her terrible realization, just as crystals of frost and motes of flame shimmered around the Lightforged's outstretched hand. A moment later, they formed into a massive blade of silver and gold, as long as the Lightforged was tall. The Deathknight's blade, almost as wide as Estingai's hand, extended from an arched crossguard, thickening near the end where a small crescent of metal had been removed, golden cracks webbing out over the silvery metal. The weapon ended in a wicked hook-like point. Kifiritari! Someone, Tepio, breathed from behind. Estingai steeled herself, even as her heart pounded and her legs threatened to turn to jelly. Kifiritari. This was the Amaya's Deathknight, commander of their twisted, all but immortal Lightforged. The creature that had murdered and broken many whom Estingai held dear. Most Lightforged carried some sort of iron weaponry to use along with their auroromancy. But that cursed blade was synonymous with the Deathknight. Black nodes and clear nodes still bright. Estingai brightened her gray nodes, granting her increased speed and reflexes, and brightened her red nodes. A solid golden substance coalesced in Estingai's hands, forming two round shields, each over 1.5 meters in diameter. Hardlight didn't cut as well as a sword made of metal, but the blunt edges of the shield would work better for Estingai's purposes. A quick glance to her left showed her Sphamaku had formed his own shields, though his were darklight. The deep, violet, almost black substance seemed to fade into wisps at the edges and had more of a bounce to it when struck than Hardlight. The Deathknight stopped a few paces away and leveled its massive blade at Estingai and Sphamaku. Then it switched its grip on the weapon with a flick of the wrist and slammed the tip down into the floor, sinking almost 1/4 of its length into the stone. Estingai blinked as the Deathknight then fell into a ready stance. Rather than wonder at that, Estingai roared as she leapt forward, knowing Sphamaku would follow. Her cry echoed off the walls, bolstered by the cries of the commander's aides as they rushed to help. "Protect the commanders!" Sphamaku barked. Estingai rushed the Deathknight, roaring and raising her shields as she flared her violet nodes, directing twin bursts of lightning through her hardlight weapons and toward the Deathknight. The creature raised its own hardlight shield, blocking Estingai's attack even as it sent a burst of violet fire towards Sphamaku, forcing him to shelter behind his shield. At the first sign of pressure from her foe's barrier, Estingai twisted out of the way just in time to avoid being thrown back by the wall of hardlight. She thrust for the creature's armpit where the armor was weak, but the Deathknight blocked the edge of her shield with its armored wrist and spun, missing Estingai with its kick, but connecting with Sphamaku's side, forcing him back. Estingai gritted her teeth. Don't worry about him. His gray nodes protect him. While, as a fireborn, Estingai's gray nodes enhanced her speed, Iceborn like Sphamaku and Narvik used them to enhance their strength. Their grey nodes also made them more durable, able to take an enhanced blow without their ribs shattering. Estingai glanced at her husband, who met her eyes through his elk-like mask, and nodded. They would attack as one this time. Estingai flared her grey nodes and violet nodes, leaping toward the Deathknight as energy roared through her. She aimed high, directing a crackling bolt of lightning toward the Deathknight. Sfamaku aimed low. Just as the Deathknight conjured another hard light shield to block her attack, Estingai's vision flashed white-blue. She bared her teeth as the Deathknight blocked that as well. Estingai switched tactics, dismissing her hard light blade and instead using her red nodes and violet nodes in combination to send darts of hard light wreathed in violet flames, speeding toward the Deathknight. Sfamaku supported her with needles of ice. The Deathknight countered both with another shield, this one of dark light that deflected the projectiles back toward them. Estingai had expected that. Flaring her green nodes, she ripped chunks of volcanic rock from the floor and hurled them at the Deathknight, one low, one straight at the Darklight shield. The Lightforged conjured another highlight shield to stop the first from hitting its feet, but stumbled as the second hit its Darklight shield with enough force to bend it and hit its mark. The shield absorbed enough of the blow to keep it from injuring the Deathknight, but Hardlight and Darklight both had an important drawback. The more force brought against a construct, the more Aurora Light one had to feed into it to maintain the structure. That was the only way to defeat a Lightforged skilled in Auroramancy. Wear down its Aurora Light. Whatever allowed them to heal used Aurora Light, and that was finite. Estingai just hoped she and Sfamaku were skilled enough to hold out that long. They danced with the Deathknight in a display of fire, ice, lightning, stone, and constructs of darkness and light that pushed Estingai to the limits of her abilities. Starless Knights, can we win this? Estingai was starting to doubt that they could. She had one ability she hadn't used yet. One she only used if absolutely necessary, as it consumed Aurora Light at the fastest of all 12 abilities. Sfamaku hadn't used his yet either, and neither had the Deathknight. The extra sense Estingai's black notes granted her allowed her to not only detect someone using Auroramancy, but what biogems they brightened. It took training to recognize the individual signatures, almost like little rhythms and melodies, but she'd done so until it was instinctual. The Deathknight had yet to brighten its amber notes. Just as Estingai primed her own amber notes, the Deathknight forced her and Sfamaku back with twin walls of hard light. Estingai braced herself, keeping upright as her boots slid over the smooth floor despite the cracks she'd created in it. The confines of the cave already hampered the more acrobatic fighting style she and her husband had been trained in, and their current opponent's capabilities eliminated the close quarters advantage it normally provided them. Estingai flared her red notes for a moment, creating her own hard light barrier and pushing back enough against the Deathknights that the creature released it. Jaw clenched, Estingai glared at the Deathknight for a moment. Burn it. Dim clear nodes, she barked, hoping the Deathknight would take a moment to do so. Estingai flared her gray nodes and her amber nodes, allowing her to draw and cock her revolver with supernatural speed, then unloaded on the Deathknight. She brightened her red nodes as she pulled the trigger, creating small hard light shields around her ears under her helmet, just to be safe. She unloaded all 6 rounds of her first moon clip on the Deathknight, 2 center mass, 2 to the head, and 1 to each kneecap, aiming for the gemstones in the armor when she could. Her amber nodes allowed her to anticipate where the Deathknight's shields would pop up and fire at the best target. The speed at which she pulled the trigger would have jammed most firearms, but she always carried one made for Auroramancies like her. Amber nodes still flared, quickly eating away at her Aurora Light. Estingai released the spent clip and loaded a new one, repeating her pattern. She did the same with her third clip, conserving the last 2 rounds and holstering the firearm once more as she dismissed the shields around her ears. They rang still, but only slightly. She dented and scratched the Deathknight's armor in a few places and cracked 1 gemstone, but the number of rounds at the creature's feet meant most had hit its shields of hard light and dark light. Sfamaku had emptied his clips as well. There were more rounds at the Deathknight's feet than she'd fired. Estingai tensed, ready to come at the Deathknight again, When the commander's aides, bodyguards, really, rushed past her, weapons raised and gem crests shining with aurora light. "That thing will slaughter them." Estingai took half a step forward when something caught her arm. She whirled, wide-eyed, to find Sfemaku behind her. He'd erected a dark light shield between them and the Deathknight. "Get the commanders out of here," he said, eyes dark, intense. "I'll wear it down and follow you out." Estingai shook her head. "Neither of us have taken down a normal one alone. You expect me to leave you here with that?" She glanced toward the Deathknight, stomach nodding as it killed the first two aides to approach it with spikes of violet ice through their necks. "I'm not sure we can take that together." Sfemaku wobbled his head, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "All the more reason for you to leave." "Not without you." His eyes grew strained. "Please don't fight me on this. I'll occupy it long enough to disengage, then lose it in the tunnels. I can stay down here longer than it can." Estingai clenched her teeth. He had a point. Running out of aurora light made one lightless, but waiting until the next aurora would fix that. Lightforged seemed to need aurora light to live, from what they'd been able to gather. At the very least, they could be killed once their aurora light ran out. If Sfemaku could trick it into following him deeper into the tunnels... "Fine," she relented. "But you need to promise me you'll run when the time comes. Don't stay and fight like some honorable idiot." He nodded, relaxing just a bit. "I promise. Now, go." Estingai nodded, eyes growing hot as she gazed at him through their helmets for one last moment, wishing she could kiss him. With a strangled grunt, she ripped her arm from his grip, stalking back toward where the commanders, still around the table, stood tense and spellbound. "Out!" Estingai barked, gesturing to the nearby tunnel. "Retreat as planned and don't stop until you get to your extraction points." The commanders hesitated, but not long enough for her to need to repeat the command. As they headed toward the exit, Estingai spun around for one last look at her husband, in time to see the last aide crushed against the wall. Sfemaku still looked after her, darklight shield between him and the Deathknight. The creature strode toward him, one hand crackling with energy as a blade of violet ice formed in the other. It stepped over the corpses at its feet as though they were nothing more than rubble. "Sfemaku!" Sfemaku whipped around, darklight shield dissipating into violet-black wisps even as he formed a blade of darklight large enough to match the Deathknight's own, moving with the speed of a fireborn with flared gray nodes. His blade connected with a sickening crunch, sending the Deathknight back a step as it reached for its face. Estingai blinked, eyes wide, when she realized Sfemaku's strike had ripped off its faceplate. When the Deathknight removed its hand from its face, the entire chamber grew cold. Estingai's knees threatened to buckle. "No," she breathed, horrified, mind rejecting what she saw. "No. Darkness, please. No." The skin was a pale white gray instead of dark blue. The markings glittering gold instead of black, matching the glowing eyes. But Estingai knew that face. "Koshitere," she breathed. Sfemaku went rigid, darklight blade fading to smoke. "No. It can't be." The creature wearing the face of Koshitere, former champion of the Union, gazed at Sfemaku for a moment, then Estingai. Estingai hadn't seen the woman die herself. She and Sfemaku had been far across the battlefield, but people they trusted had told Estingai that her mother-in-law, the woman that had taken her in after the Amaya took her family, was dead, slain by the God King himself. This had to be some sort of trick. But if it isn't, how? Estingai! Svimaku cried, his voice strained. Run! Estingai found herself frozen as the Deathknight looked past her, raised its hand, then clenched it into a fist. Green light glowed at the Deathknight's brow and beneath its breastplate, and the cavern rumbled, loud cracks echoing throughout the chamber. Estingai looked back at the commanders. All of them stood frozen, gazing at the Deathknight with the same disbelief that Estingai felt. They failed to move fast enough when the roof caved in on them. She looked back to Svimaku in time to see the Deathknight's massive blade form in its hand. It raised the weapon. Estingai stepped forward, then heard something above her. She looked up just in time to see her reflection in the enormous slab of polished rock that fell down on top of her. Estingai woke to complete and utter darkness. The first breath she sucked in came out in a coughing fit that hurt her side. Something inside her was broken. Dust had gotten underneath her mask somehow, and the air was thick and stuffy, smelling of sweat and blood. Her mind, it wasn't working right. And she hurt so much. She tried to move and found she couldn't. Her aching muscles worked, but something else restricted her. Light. She needed light and air. Estingai reached for her jacket's zipper. She could manage that at least. She loosened it and tugged at the padding and shirt she wore underneath, then frowned when the light she expected didn't come. When Estingai's clouded mind processed that and what it meant, I'm lightless. Estingai closed her eyes, fighting down the momentary panic and trying to remember what had happened. It was hard. People could function while lightless, but the absence of aurora light depressed them in every way. It dulled everything: emotions, thoughts, sensations, even pain. The last of those worried Estingai the most. She'd been fighting, about to run when she saw. How? Questrima and the others wouldn't have lied about that. They would have made sure. Estingai shuddered. Even her lightless mind couldn't dull the horror at remembering what she'd seen. Don't focus on that. Not now. The ceiling had caved in. She'd flared her green nodes and red nodes at the last moment, pushing back at the rock and conjuring a hard light shell around her. That had saved her from being crushed by the falling rock, but used up most of her remaining aurora light. After that, even flaring her opal nodes for a massive burst of power hadn't been enough to shove the rubble away. The strain and sudden lack of aurora light in her system had caused her to pass out. I'm trapped, and lightless.